Welcome to PhD with Women on It Hack the Future. My name is Beata Young, and today's PhD Positivity Hack Delivered will be our guest, Cindy Watson. Topic: Embrace Feminine Wisdom, Transform Your Negotiation Skills with Cindy Watson. Episode 145 starts here. Let me remind you, this is a grassroots community that focuses on women on IT, an inclusive forum of women in technology, startups, and female leaders who are supported by men as well. And I bring heart to that hustle because empathy is my mojo, and empathy is critical when you're embracing feminine wisdom. First, let me remind you what's been happening in the world of our community. Applause to our former PhD guest, Darinka Burowska, for her success at Berlin's first AI Rouge Circle, a tech community of founders, engineers, investors, and entrepreneurs across Europe. Event on May 24th. You go, girl. Congratulations to Naira Hashem, our former PhD guest, on her successful speech at the Flutter conference on May 28 29th. Keep inspiring future Flutterers, Naira. And finally, cheers to Claire Pagano, GE Aerospace IT and Digital Tech Director, for winning the 2024 Hot Topics Future CIO 100 Award for the second year in a row. Keep inspiring us, Claire. Now let's go back to our topic. Embrace feminine wisdom. Transform your negotiation skills. In the world of negotiation, success can often be portrayed as a battlefield where victory goes to the strongest and most assertive. There are, however, voices emerging to challenge this traditional view in an era of inclusivity and diversity. Join us on this episode, ask your questions, and join the excellent guest, Cindy Watson. Cindy is an award-winning author, dynamic speaker, and founder of Woman on Purpose. How close to Woman on IT! And she's here to share her invaluable insights on how embracing feminine wisdom can revolutionize the negotiation landscape. Discover the art of negotiation and persuasion with Cindy and transform your approach to negotiating. Now, Cindy, where in the world are you today joining us from?
Well, thank you for having me. I love your intro, by the way. It's very spicy and catchy. I am joining you today from Muskoka, Canada, actually. So it is, if I start melting, we're having a bit of a hot one out there today. It's great to be here.
It's not just melting from the heat of the topic today. So let's start with your journey to that hot climate. What inspired you to focus on the concept of feminine negotiation and create persuasion program?
Yeah, great question. And for me, I had, I grew up in a low rental sort of apartment complex. It was considered a tough neighborhood by many. Of course, for me, it was just home at the time. But I think, as often happens when you come from that kind of background, I was really driven, right? So I went right from, high school to university to law school, really seeking those sort of straight A marks. And when I started the practice of law, very quickly, you start out as this fresh faced 20-something-year-old, and I was almost always the only woman in the room. Like, all of my clients, for the most part, were male. The adjudicators were predominantly male. The other side was always male. And I looked around and thought, I better get scrappier or they're not going to take me seriously. And I think that often happens to women in business. And so I did. I got scrappy. And, my clients called me the Barracuda, which they meant as a compliment. And I am now embarrassed to say I wore like a badge of honor for a long time. But there is a really high cost that comes from that. And for me, at least, it started seeping into my professional relationships and then my personal relationships and ultimately even my sense of self. And then I had an epiphany that, you know what, when I think back to how I used to negotiate, how I used to show up, before I started the practice of law, before I got all of this conditioning, I was bringing more so-called feminine or soft skills to the table and having better success, great success. And then I started really digging, and the more I looked into it, I'm like, wow, if you look at the most effective negotiators throughout history and throughout time, they're actually people who used so-called feminine traits, right? And most of them would agree that the skills that make the best negotiators are that kind of rapport building and empathy and flexibility and intuition and trust. And then that was my epiphany, is like, all of life is a negotiation, and women lose out on so much when we buy into the myths and conditioning about what it means to be a great negotiator. So that's been my mission, and I think that's probably what started me on this path.
Well, it started interesting because I am a great fan of The Wrong Missy, the movie, where there is a character called Barracuda, and she's working in the corporate environment, and
Yeah,
definitely she's not the nicest of the lot.
yeah.
So, what was your style as a negotiator?
Well, and it's funny you asked that, because I took a negotiation course in law school, and I wasn't conscious at the time about my style. And it's only in with the benefit of hindsight I look back now, because we basically were negotiating for our marks throughout the course of the year. So, we'd get a simulated exercise. We'd have to break off into pairs. Whoever got the best negotiated settlement got the best mark. And in a competitive law school, things got pretty competitive. And yet my style wasn't that. I came to every one, and I won virtually every one of those simulated negotiations. And I'm not saying that to brag, but because of the epiphany that came later. At that time, when you asked what my style was, I came to every one of those going, we've only got 50 minutes and we have to get a deal. What do you need? What do you want? Talk to me. And I came with curiosity and empathy, and I was all about building trust and relationship, and got exceptional outcomes every time. And it wasn't until much later I realized my style as a litigator for a long time, until I had my epiphany, was definitely aggressive, on the aggressive side, because I think we're often conditioned to believe that's the path to success in business, in law, in life. And I was guilty as charged. And now I would say my style is reverting back to that same young woman in law school, where I bring a very collaborative and curious approach to the table, looking for the best possible outcomes for everyone.
Well, that transpires that it's really very sought after a quality on many levels, not just in litigation, but also, for example, in the boardroom or
Absolutely.
as a management style. So, what are the qualities? What would you like to say to those who are called barracudas or sharks or however they are called, that feel that their style may be a bit off putting and may not be a good ground for setting the atmosphere around the room?
Yeah, and I just love having these conversations. I think the more we talk about it, because we don't talk about it enough. I think we are so conditioned in the world today to see these so-called soft skills or feminine skills as a liability, right? We buy into the myth that toughness carries the day. The person talking the loudest and the longest is the person who is winning the negotiation. Even this concept of winning versus losing, that competitive approach, I guess the advice I would give is, for those of you who have bought into that model, and maybe like me, you're finding that there's a bit of a price to pay, I really encourage you, lean into your feminine, right? And I do believe we're seeing, sort of post-COVID, a new leadership paradigm that's actually being recognized. There was a lot of talk during COVID about the fact that countries with female leaders were doing better. I don't know if that's true or not, and I never get in the muck about that. But at the very least, the thing that became clear is so-called feminine traits or skills were being seen as really strong leadership skills for the first time in a very long time, in a very, very long time. So I guess my advice would be, really lean into that feminine. And I don't know if you want me to talk about sort of what the skills are that I would recommend for that, but happy
Let's
to do that
let's
as well.
go for it. Since you mentioned, what are the skills that you really want us to focus on developing?
Yeah, I would say contrary to popular belief. I mean, I have a model, I call it the R-FIT model. And it's when I'd mentioned earlier about when I started really digging into research about what does make the best negotiator. And I came up with 6 key skills that show up across the board. And ironically, even though we don't practice it, even though we're not taught it, most experts agree that these are those key skills. So the first is assertive, and I call the model R-FIT because it's AREFIT. So those are the 6 skills that you want to bring to the table. And the first is assertiveness. But the key is most people confuse assertive with aggressive, and they're not the same thing at all, right? Assertiveness just means showing up with confidence. That confidence comes from knowledge, and that knowledge comes from preparation. So do the preparation going in, and you'll be able to stand from a place of assertiveness without having to be aggressive. Empathy is I guess doing them in order. And so A is assertive, R is rapport building. And I would say I think as women, we have forgotten the fact that historically, we needed to develop really strong rapport building skills as a survival skill. I mean, we didn't have many rights. We didn't have the right to historically to vote or to hold property or credit in our own name. So as a result, as a survival skill, we built rapport. Bring that to the table. That to me is one of the key skills. Don't jump straight to business. We're really guilty of that in North America. Negotiation is all about connection and relationship. So be intentional about building that relationship and find those points of connection. Flexibility isn't, well, empathy, I guess if we're going in order here, then you've got, so ARE, really truly seek to put yourself in the shoes of the other party. And I think we often pay lip service to that, but I would say look to truly seek to understand and meet the needs of the other party. Consider what their fears are coming into a negotiation. And then you've got FIT, flexibility, avoid being so attached to just one possible outcome or one truth, to the need to be right in a negotiation. And we're good at this, right? I mean, as women, we naturally juggle and multitask. At any given time, we've probably got 100 balls in the air. So apply that same flexibility to our thinking when we show up to negotiate, whether personally or professionally. It opens up possibilities for better outcomes. And the I, again, intuition, we call it women's intuition for a reason. But somewhere along the way, I don't know about you, but I think we got conditioned to stop trusting it. So I would say tap back into that intuition, hone it, develop it, rely on it. If you've got a little voice warning you or telling you to jump into something, trust it, right? The T is for trust building. But I would also say one of the skills that doesn't fit in my R-FIT model, but it sort of falls under empathy, curiosity, probably the single most thing. I call it the art of fascination. Curiosity is key. Cultivate it. Ask questions, listen more than you talk, and show up truly curious about what the other party needs, why they need it, why they're resistant to the ideas you're bringing to the table, what are the factors that make them believe that. That will be a game changer if you adopt those strategies.
We have first comment from Olga Vasina, who says, all life is a negotiation. Great point, Cindy Watson. Thank you, Olga, for your comment. And let's delve into your experience, because as you mentioned, you've been in social justice for law for 30 years. How has your transition happened? What made you stop in your track of being barracuda and going through the waters?
I think there were a series of, like most of us, right? If I'm being really honest and looking back, I think there were a series of sort of warnings or little mini epiphanies. But when there's deep conditioning, like women are subjected to, and I think the world today, right? I mean, but women in particular have extra baggage around the conditioning about how we need to show up, how to define success. I think one of my first big epiphanies was when I had our first year. We started late and made up for lost time and had 3 kids in 3 years. And when with my firstborn, she got diagnosed at 2 months old with a really serious heart defect and needed open heart surgery. And we almost everything that could go wrong did. We were in critical care for 3 months. And I didn't realize it at the time, but in hindsight, I recognized we were basically negotiating for her life every day. It was a series of negotiations. And if you'd ever thought there was a time I would have brought that barracuda to the table, it would have been then when we're fighting for her life, right? And yet I didn't. I reverted to that natural, intuitive, sort of feminine strength, if you will, without even being conscious of it. I was building rapport with the doctors, with the nurses, with the administrative staff. I was bringing empathy to the table, commiserating with them and how challenging their job was, particularly with budget cuts, and building those relationships. I was having to stay flexible. Like, my gosh, this was language I'd never heard of, and the ground seemed to be shifting with crisis after crisis every day. As 99% of the population reacted one way, my daughter just always seemed to be the 1% that reacted differently. And those skills, ironically, that I was just talking about, I was building trust and trusting my intuition, which, oh my gosh, there were moments when I got to tell you, it was tough to trust my intuition, because I'm like, I'm not a doctor. I'm going toe to toe with some of the country's leading cardiologists here. And I was just trusting on pure intuition, because the first times when I raised my tentative hand and raised suggestions or observations and I was, shushed or poo-pooed, and it turned out I was right, I'm like, I am trusting my instincts. So that was a huge epiphany for me, but it didn't last long, to be honest, right? I fell back into those old patterns in my work. I came back to work starting with this new approach, a softer approach, but fell back into that conditioning. And the final push, if you will, was really quite a simple thing. I was having a conversation with one of my boys, and I could tell he was getting frustrated, and I thought we're just having a normal discussion. And suddenly he just exploded, and he's like, "For God's sake, Mom, does every conversation with you have to be an argument that you win?" And I've got to tell you, man, it was like somebody took my heart and threw it on the ground, and it shattered that hard heart in a million pieces. And that for me was when I really got intentional about digging in, doing more research, and coming to my epiphany, and actually starting programming for others so I could share that epiphany with other women.
That's beautiful. From bear mama to barracuda to bear mama again. Now, one thing though, my slight observation is, isn't it the outsider's view on a litigation process is, oh, find me the best lawyer who's gonna win it for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting because I have been doing some work with lawyers, and I realized the reason I call this a mission, I mean, it's, a lot of people kind of balk when we use that expression because everybody's talking about their mission these days. But for me, I think because our social conditioning runs so deep, and not just for both men and women, when we've been conditioned to define success in business, in law, and beyond, based on a very competitive winner-take-all model, I think both men and women start to see the so-called soft skills as a liability. And so what do? We stifle them, right? We end up stifling them. I certainly bought into exactly that model that you're saying. If people want me as a lawyer, I'm going to have to be the toughest lawyer. I'm going to have to go for every last inch on the table. And I did that for a long time. And what I found, and what I'm hoping to get the message out there so that we all start changing our way of thinking around this, is what that does is actually separates people. And if you look at our legal system and really think about it, even people who supposedly win the cases, they walk away feeling like they were, Russell Crowe and Gladiator. They still feel beaten by the process because there is no real winning when you come from that kind of competitive, take no prisoners approach. It is exhausting, and it hurts our soul, not to be too corny about it. So I think all parties end up walking away from our legal system feeling just brutalized by the process. So that's a mindset shift that we're going to have to start getting the word out, that actually, even, and I would say especially in our legal system, if we show up with more outside the box thinking and truly get curious about what's the root of the conflict, let's see this conflict as an opportunity to find something better, I think we would find much better overall solutions for everybody. There would be more so-called winners in the process. That's my current thinking on that.
That's a lovely sentiment, although we know that many mafiosos would disagree with that, and many others who had to go through lengthy processes just to win and be not guilty, found not guilty, or
Yeah.
win a big mansion from that alimony and extra alimony here. So we have an interesting question from Patrick. Thank you very much. Speaking of divorce and so on, not that I'm planning one. That's my husband is asking. That's a great point about parental arguing negotiation to win, Cindy. Question for you: how do you make sure that a close negotiation stays settled, aka it's easy in a low case, but with example stuff?
Yeah, that's a great, great question. And interestingly, one of the things that really supports my strong belief in this sort of new philosophy, if you will, about how to approach this, because I think under that more competitive model, and again, whether it's in business, in law, or even in our personal relationships, or we deal with service providers every day, whether you're hiring a contractor, when we take that competitive approach, when we're looking to get every last nickel, the very best price, people typically, what happens is one party ends up leaving with some resentment, and you don't get the kind of buy-in that makes for best long-lasting outcomes, if I'm understanding your question correctly. Whereas when you take the approach that I encourage, that we're talking about here today, when people feel fully seen and heard and respected in the process, you're much more likely to get a fuller buy-in, and then you get those longer lasting agreements that are much less likely to break down the road, either in that particular deal, or if we have repeat dealings, whether in our negotiations with our family, for example, or our friends, or with service providers, or in business. Then the next time, the person's not going to be trying to put one over on you because they feel they were taken advantage of. They're going to be open to that reciprocity, and it just triggers better long-lasting relationships, which means better long-lasting outcomes. I hope that answered the question. I'm not sure if I have.
Sure, Patrick will follow up if he needs more clarity on that. However, let's go back to our questions. I have prepared some for you earlier. So you emphasize the power of empathy, communication, and emotional intelligence in negotiations. Can you share a personal experience where these qualities led to a successful negotiation outcome?
You bet. And I'll start with a personal one, because most people don't think of our personal relationships as negotiations. So one of the things I really am, feel excited about doing is shifting people's perspective about broadening how you even look at what constitutes a negotiation. And I'm going to be very vulnerable and transparent here because it's quite a personal story. So at the beginning of COVID, one of my boys got diagnosed with a very serious mental health issue, and he ended up having to be hospitalized for a period of time. And he was angry, as you can expect. He felt he'd been stripped of all of his power. And what happens as Mama Bear, I show up, and he was, every interaction when I'd visit would be, with him blaming and shaming and angry. And of course, I didn't prep because it was so emotional and personal. At the beginning, I wasn't practicing what I preach. I wasn't following my own models, ironically. I was more in defensive mode, and I'd be trying to explain and justify and show him why this was for the best. And then suddenly I'm like, oh my gosh. So it was like every visit, just, I practically left in tears. It just felt like the relationship was fracturing. And then I thought, oh my gosh, Cindy, you are not practicing your own models. And one of those models, we can talk about it later, but I call it the no fear model. And suffice it to say, it's about really considering what are the fears that the other party brings to the table. What fears am I bringing to the table? How is that impacting on this negotiation? How is the other party showing up with ego? How am I bringing you to the table, and what can I do about that? The A, so that's FE. The A, you can tell I like acronyms, make it easy to remember. The A is for attachment. What things are they being too attached to? What am I too attached to? And the R is reactivity. What things are going to trigger their reactivity, and what am I being triggered to be reactive? And I just went through a simple, quick check in on that model. And oh my gosh, I was mortified at how I had been showing up. And at the next visit, I showed up thinking, I can't imagine his fear must be off the charts. His entire world turned upside down. Of course, his ego is being attacked as he feels stripped of it. He's attached to what his old lifestyle, what he envisioned for himself, and what the possibilities are now. And of course, he was coming from a place of reactivity, as had I been, and I was too attached to it. So I showed up from a place of absolute curiosity. And at first, and for your listeners out there as well, recognize that if you're used to showing up as a barracuda or with that tough, more competitive model that we're conditioned to, and then you try this model, at first there will be resistance. So be prepared for that, because people won't trust it. And certainly that was the case with my son. He didn't trust it at first, and he kept pushing and pushing. And I just stayed in that place of curiosity and compassion and empathy. And I saw a physical softening of him before my eyes, and it profoundly changed our relationship. And we now, as we navigate through this new reality for him, we have an incredibly strong bond. He trusts me above his doctors. He'll always come and ask what I think. And we operate as a team moving forward together, as opposed to being in constant conflict, which I see a lot with other people in that situation. So may not be the kind of business example you were thinking of when you asked the question, but hopefully that helps show how profound the impact of these different approaches can be in our to negotiate better lives personally and professionally.
Right. Quite often, though, we are put on the spot of having to negotiate without preparation.
Yeah.
So, in case that happens, what are the three critical components that are necessary in order for you to feel that, okay, I may not have had the best preparation, but I had the best outcome I could have at that moment?
Yeah, beautiful. And great question. I would say tap in first to, and again, one of my models, and we can talk about it later if time permits, but I call it the 5W model. And it's just do a simple check-in of who, what, where, when, why. So if you're asking for three things, I would say the first one would be focus on that who. Take a moment to ground yourself and think, who do I want to show up as in this negotiation? Because we often hear people don't always remember what you say, that famous Maya Angelou quote, right? They don't remember what you say, they don't remember what you do, but they will remember how you make them feel. So in a negotiation, consider, who do I want to be? Actually choose three words to ground yourself, right? Do I want to be calm, compassionate, compelling? There's no right or wrong answer. Just be intentional about who you want to be, and consider, who are they likely to show up as? So you can be prepared so you're not reactive, right? Okay, if they show up trying to bully me, here I'm going to ground myself in my three words. If they show up doing this, here's how I am. So I would say the who is really critical. The second thing, if you're saying how can you just quickly, is curiosity. How can I bring curiosity to the table, right? What are some questions that I can ask? Let me think of some powerful questions to kickstart this conversation so I can listen and find those better outcomes. And the third we touched on earlier, I would say, is intuition. Because if you're talking about, we don't always have the time to prepare, I've got to make some really quick decisions here, I'm thrown into the limelight and I need to be able to negotiate, decide the who, to get your curiosity piece down, and then tap into your intuition and trust it. Leave yourself open to really be in tune with yourself and your reactions, watching for that body language, watching for the tone of voice shifts in the conversation, being really intentional about who you're showing up on those same, and trust your intuition. They're not leaning into this. They're pushing away from me on this. Let me ask some questions so I can get them back on board and try and get those better outcomes. So I would say those would be the three, if you're in a crunch time, that will still serve you well to get better outcomes.
Beautiful. However, I'm thinking about, and I'm throwing in some, like a barracuda style, some difficult cases. So I'm thinking about how difficult it might be for those who experience the fear of speaking up, or they prefer
Yes.
to be less outspoken. So, for those introverts, what would be your number one advice? How to break that silence and make sure that you still spoke, even though sometimes words have difficulty leaving you?
Yeah. Yeah, that this is a subject very sensitive. As you can tell, I'm not shy, right? I tend to be an extrovert. And I talked about my firstborn, Jade, my daughter. She is an introvert. And that was a real eye opener for me and has really informed a lot of the work that I do right now, because she would fall exactly into that category that you were just describing. She would be very shy to ask for what she wants. And so I did a lot of work in this actually. And I've written a couple of articles about it because surprisingly, most introverts assume that they're going to be at a disadvantage in negotiations. So the first thing I would say to any of your audience, any of your community sharing with us here today, if you are an introvert, don't let your inner critic tell you that you are going to be less than or at a disadvantage, because in fact, most introverts are at an advantage if they lean into the kind of traits that they typically embody in negotiations. Because most of us who are extroverts, we talk more than we listen. We try and dominate the conversations. We suck up all the energy in the room. We've been taught that that makes a strong leader, a strong negotiator. And in fact, the opposite is true. So the advice I would give for that introvert is, if you find it difficult to speak up, first lean into your strengths, which is listening, paying attention, thinking a little bit more deeply, not giving those knee-jerk responses, but thinking before you speak. And having said that, I talked earlier about the difference between assertive and aggressive. Even though aggressiveness is not your style, and frankly, that's a blessing because aggressiveness doesn't serve anybody, have the confidence to ask for what you want. And for your listeners who are women, women in particular tend to ask much less frequently for what we want. It's not a surprise. We're conditioned, don't make waves, be the giver. We don't even like to receive. We struggle. We don't even receive compliments well, right? Oh, you look great today. Oh, no, my hair's a mess. Oh, this whole thing. So I would say lean into asking, listen, absorb, and then get curious and ask questions, and have that confidence that you are coming for a place where you have the ability and you deserve to ask for what you want.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Cindy, we have a follow up answer from Patrick, who said, "What a fascinating angle. That's a terrific answer. Yes, expectation management is also a key factor where some men, always men, tend to see themselves as more important." Right. I'm thinking about the time that I had to negotiate with mediators, so it was much easier. However, at one point, because it was, I got very emotional as a mother, a mama bear. I was fighting for the custody of our daughter with
Yeah.
my ex-husband, and I was really, really crushed when I heard that my non negotiable is going to be crushed. So, how do you prepare for that blow? Do you walk out? Because that's what I did, and eventually I could negotiate back. Or is there another approach that you suggest? Maybe sleeping over it?
Yeah. My God, your questions are fabulous, by the way. I must say, I have done a lot of interviews, and these are some of the best questions I have ever had, very deep. So thank you for that. It makes for such an interesting conversation. And it's interesting, a couple of threads that I'll just pull briefly, because I think that it's a great question and it's a little layered. And one is, we're very conditioned, like sort of historical, traditional thought processes about negotiation are emotion has no place in a negotiation. And it's ironically one of the reasons why women got a bad rap, because the assumption is women are more emotional, women are going to get emotional, and therefore women aren't great negotiators. So with your indulgence, I'll speak to that really quickly and then circle back as well to pull the other thread of this. But on that, I disagree. I think we are human beings, and humans are emotional creatures. And I think when we show up with that stoic, hold our cards close to our chest, don't ever show vulnerability, I think we miss out on incredible opportunities to get solutions that are beyond what we think we're negotiating about. Like, I want X, you want Y, where either one's going to get X or one will get Y, or we'll split the baby. And in fact, the more vulnerable that we allow ourselves to be, the more we let our real emotions come in. Don't be emotional, but allow yourself to feel and experience the emotion. The more we're going to find, oh, do you know what? You need this? I can hook you up with somebody who can help you get that. So we could actually get a better price on this because I can make you a ton more money by hooking you up with some of my contacts over here. Or there's this other opportunity that I can get. Oh, you happen to know so-and-so? I've been looking to try and get a FaceTime in front of a literary agent. So how about we do this on this and you hook me up? You see the point that when we allow ourselves to be more vulnerable. And the other thing is, we as humans tend to go like this when things get emotional, right? We push back from it. If you're in a negotiation and somebody is being emotional, lean into it. Start questioning. This seems to have caused a reaction. Tell me more about that. What's happening right now? Do you mind sharing with me? Because that's where the gold is, where you find what people's deep why is in a negotiation. And in your situation, your deep why was, my kids are not negotiable, right? I want, and that was something you felt deep emotion about because it was such a deep why for you. And we get better outcomes when we can actually tap into that deep why. Having said that, going back to the quite specific part of your question, so I would say lean in, whether you're the one being emotional or the other person. Be willing to have that vulnerability and lean in. You're likely going to get more creative outcomes. Having said that, if you're at a point where you are frazzled and you cannot get yourself back to following a no fear model or an R-fit model or sticking to your 3, who do I want to be in this negotiation? Absolutely ask for a timeout. Go allow yourself to cool off. If you know that you're done for the day, ask to reschedule. There is nothing wrong with that. And in fact, that is a much better option than continuing to show up from a place of reactivity. So I would separate out, all of that is a long-winded way of saying, separate emotion from reactivity. They're two different things. If you find you are in reactive mode, absolutely step away from the negotiation. Allow yourself the space and grace to be able to show up to get better outcomes. But if you're feeling human emotion, that's okay. Don't be afraid to lean into that. In some cases, it can really empower you to actually show up to get better outcomes. I don't know if that helps.
Oh, absolutely, it helps. Just to give you a bit of background, it was a case of some lie going to be written on the official document. So I just lost it. So, anyway, that's okay. I made my point and eventually all turned okay, but I just would not allow a lie that was written a couple of years back to be written again on the mediation papers. Anyway, let's go.
I like, and just on that though, I first, kudos to you. And I think integrity is such an important part of negotiation. And we are a society, when we look at our media, our entertainment today, it's easy to forget that because we seem to celebrate the more ruthless characters. You know, most of our so-called protagonists in the hit TV shows these days are actually the anti-hero. So kudos to you for sticking to your guns on that issue where the integrity of the process was an issue. I support that wholeheartedly and encourage other people to as well.
Absolutely. Also, here is another question I wanted to ask you, Cindy. How about manipulation? When you feel manipulated, how do you go about without going aggressive and saying you're manipulating facts here?
Yeah.
How do you tackle that problem?
Yeah, that's great. And it's funny, it's because that manipulation is a form of, there are a number of tactics that people can use in negotiations. And it's one thing, I have a whole chapter in my book talking about tactics, because it's important to be aware of the tactics if you're going to be able to deal with them. And we often aren't, right? We often aren't aware when somebody's using a tactic against us. So, but in this case, for your question, if you reach a point where you're like, oh my gosh, I'm being manipulated, and you recognize that, there are a few options. And with most, there's no like sort of biblical, this is right, this is wrong sort of answer, but it's about getting more intentional. I use that word a lot because I think it's when we up level our intentionality, we're going to get better outcomes because we're going to make better decisions. So for me, if I suddenly recognize somebody is manipulating me, one approach, if we immediately, some people like to then try manipulating back. I do not advocate that strategy because things devolve. The process becomes out of integrity. We are out of integrity with our own sort of moral values and code, and you're not going to get best outcomes from that place. Some people get angry and go, you are a manipulative bully. Name calling will virtually never inspire somebody to be the best version of themselves. One thing I have found, even with bullies or manipulators, is to call the behavior out, but in a way where you are almost, you do it in the guise of a compliment, where it's like, I know that treating people with dignity and respect is something that's really important to you, Joe. And I feel like I'm not sure what's happening here, but it almost feels like we've got a little manipulation going on. And I know that's not your normal style. So let's just take a moment and regroup here. So that we can, I know we both want to treat each other with dignity and respect and get best outcomes. It is surprising how often even bullies will, it kind of shocks them out of their model, if you will, and triggers a reciprocity because you've treated them with respect and calling it out. So calling out the tactic is almost always going to be a very effective strategy, right? So recognize the tactic, call it out. The big question at the root of what I think you're asking is, how do we call it out most effectively? And I think the more respectfully you can call it out, the more you're likely to increase your chances of having things get back on track rather than further split apart.
Mm. We have a comment from Patrick. Integrity is such an important part of negotiation. That's quotation from you, Cindy. Lots of brilliant quotes today. Excellent point. Terrific show, Beata and Cindy. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you.
And thank you, Cindy.
Thank you, Patrick. Love your engagement.
Absolutely. He's clearly threatened by that divorce mentioning. Anyway, let's go to our question, which is, that's one thing that I've heard a couple of times. Life is about not so much negotiation. Life is transactional. Would you agree with that?
Yes and no, to the extent I think it's maybe semantics, but I don't love the word transactional. Like when we talk in our personal, I think we're probably saying the same thing, but with different words. For me, at least, I find the word transactional to be much more loaded because it suggests, I'm going to give something only if I get something, right? Whereas, and in our personal relationships, for example, and in business, it's about trust and connection and relationship building. And yes, you definitely want to build a foundation to have reciprocity, but it shouldn't always be about the transaction in the moment. Like there are lots of times when smart business people will negotiate to a settlement that in the short term is actually not to their benefit. But in the long term, they're thinking down the road, it is going to be exponentially better for them. But I do agree when I call it all of life as a negotiation. And I knew that a lot of people would balk. Like the title of my book is, The Art of Feminine Negotiation. Two things that I was resistant, even myself. I'm like, most people don't think about the things that I'm talking about, even as negotiations. So should I call it something else? And I'm like, no, I want to raise people's awareness about the fact that these transactions, to use your word, sort of happen in life, and we need to show up better and be more prepared for them so that we can get those best outcomes. And the second word was the word feminine, which I knew there'd be some resistance to because it's not actually gender-based. We all have masculine and feminine energies. We all have the capacity to engage so-called feminine or soft skills to the table. So yes, I believe all of life is a negotiation, including with ourselves. every day in a myriad of ways, we are having to negotiate our own mindset. It's probably our most important negotiation with our kids, with our intimate partners, as I've said, with service providers. So, yes, if you show up recognizing it as a negotiation, I prefer that word to a transaction or a relationship connection issue, then you're going to get better outcomes.
Cindy, you planted so many seeds, and I have so many questions. However, we are heading towards the end of our show, and we'll talk about your book in a minute. I just wanted to ask you about the fact of life is, especially now with young people, they want everything instant in a moment. Isn't negotiation from your approach, it's about timing, it's about the pace that is slow enough for everybody to be on the same page?
Yeah. Oh, great question. You're even making me think about things that I haven't thought about in quite that way before. Yeah, and not just kids. I think we've become a very instant gratification society. I think you'll have deeper relationships if you give more thought and put preparation. Having said that, I don't want to leave the impression that this is like, oh, every negotiation is a long prep. Some of these are really quick check-ins. Like think about me with my son, right? No fear. Okay, fear, ego, attachment, reactivity. What are my fears? How can I avoid ego attachment, right? Think of our fit. How can I show up with, what can I do to build rapport, to build empathy? These can be really quick check-ins that you can invoke in the moment, or the 5 W's, right? Who, what, where, when, why. Where should we have the conversation? When should I have this conversation? Doing any one of those check-ins will still afford you to get better outcomes. So I would say, yes, ultimately you want to be about long-term relationship building, but even in the moment, you can use any of these little tweaks to be a little more intentional and get better outcomes. Hope that helps.
Oh, absolutely. Cindy, I'm just thinking about my personal experience. And even though, it sounds almost like I'm Gandalf talking. Anyway, what I wanted to say, my friend who was getting through a custody battle once met with the court officials asking, how she can cut this lengthy custody battle because it's just dragging on for too long.
Yeah.
And one of the advice was you should not go with, first of all, government state lawyer. That's one point. But also, you should choose your lawyer that is considerate, that is not fighting and is not aggressive or anything like that, because it is a long game. So eventually, yes, she did okay. However, as we know, we are sometimes dreading. But back to your book, Cindy, your programs, Art of Feminine Negotiation, have empowered many. Can you share a success story from someone who transformed their approach and
Oh.
negotiation?
Yes, thank you for that. One that came the first one that came to mind is what I'll share. One of the women who had come to work with me at the time that she came, she was looking to quit her job because she had been subject to a course of sexual harassment. She felt she had no voice. She felt she had no power in the workplace, and she was ready to quit. And we worked together. And after a 6-month program together, she had a profound change. Not only did she come back to that workplace with her voice and being able to stand for the respect that she deserved and being able to show up and leaning into her feminine and seeing it as a strength and not a liability in her position as a supervisor. And she went on to become a vice president of the organization. It was a dramatic shift from on the door out to becoming a vice president who was really well respected in her workplace, which was a very predominantly male oriented workplace. And she was somebody in the workplace that all of her male coworkers looked up to and respected. And she went on to have a very successful career.
Well, we love not just the title, although the title is worth mentioning, The Art of Feminine Negotiation, how to get what you want from the boardroom to the bedroom. Can we extrapolate a bit at the latter? Do you have some examples?
Yeah, I think it's so many relationships fall apart because of a lack of effective communication. And a lot of sexual intimacy between couples falls apart because of a lack of communication. And if we think of these exchanges, of our intimate relationships, as a form of a negotiation dance, I often quip as well into that 5W model under the where. Some conversations you want to be having in the bedroom, some conversations should have no place in the bedroom ever. So if you follow some of these models that we're talking about and bring it into your intimate relationship, you're going to be able to get more of what you want, more intimacy, more satisfaction, both for yourself and for your partner. But in the bedroom, and also in your the intimacy of your everyday life, more respect, more appreciation for each other, and it will be a richer, deeper relationship as a result of it.
Well, it prompts me to suggest you should write a number 2 book, Masculine Negotiation, with question, where is that G spot? Anyway,
Oh, I love that.
on a more serious note, ladies and gentlemen, we have a comment from Esmeralda. I love listening to Cindy that I could spend another hour enjoying this live stream. And Patrick says, OMG, there was me thinking it was a Vista, it was vital to involve foreplay, but actually it's a framework, is the ultimate F word, LOL.
You guys are witty. I am telling you, you are quick-witted, on the ball.
I'm trying, girl. I'm trying. Anyway, let's go to our questions that we always ask. And since it is the end of our show, let's ask, imagine that you could meet any person in the world. Maybe it's the bedroom. Maybe it's, I don't know, somewhere in Fiji. Where would you like to meet them? And why would you like to meet that person?
Okay, I mean, the answers that I think everybody would expect for me on this are, Michelle Obama, Oprah, etc. My answer is probably going to be unexpected. It may seem like a strange choice, but for me, I would love to meet with Muhammad Ali. I grew up, my dad, taught inner city kids to box. He didn't teach us because he had 2 girls, but he did teach us to fight in a different way with our voice. And it amazes me that Muhammad Ali had such confidence coming from where he came from. And I would love to pick his brain about where and how did he have that great confidence that he was the greatest before he even was. And I would probably want to have that conversation with him in the diner where they denied him service after he had just won the Olympic gold medal for the USA back in the day.
Oh my goodness, I didn't know that. So it's a great fact. We learn every day. What about, I would like to learn now, what is the number 1 book that you wish you read before you started your career or your negotiation?
Before I started my career, gosh, I would say, if I'm allowed to, I would say either Tiny Habits, which is by, I think, BJ Fogg. I think he's a psychologist or something. I'm not sure. Game changer in terms of how to change those habits, right? Get your when you want to adopt new good habits or avoid bad habits. I found that book was so simple to read, and that would be a definite one. And also Motivation Manifesto by Brendan Burchard. It was such a fresh perspective about how to look at motivation and breaking down the elements of it. I think it would be a great book I'd recommend for anybody to make sure that you understand how to motivate yourself.
Motivation Manifesto and Tiny Habits, that's definitely a good habit also to read a book of Cindy. Now, can you please give us your favorite life lesson quote and how did it change you, Cindy?
Oh, there's so many now. And I've become, I used to kind of poo-poo a lot of the personal development stuff when I was young, and now I embrace it and absorb it. One I already alluded to. I think I'd probably go with that, though. The Maya Angelou quote that I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And for me, that's why I think I felt so out of integrity with myself when I was practicing law as that aggressive barracuda, because I made people feel like crap, frankly, right? And, I made witnesses cry on the stand, and that was not good for my soul or for them. So I think we could all do well in life if we just always govern ourselves based on remembering that people will remember how we made them feel in that moment.
Well, we've got great quote from Racy who fed us today with a good negotiator is someone who can convince a dog to sell his own bone, as Walt Disney says. And now, since we are heading towards the end, what's next for Cindy? What's the next big bone for Barracuda?
Well, I laughed when you said that you should do the sequel. Although I'm gonna maybe work with your idea about the G spot. That was hysterical. But I think that I'm actually partway into it already is because I really agonized over whether with art of feminine negotiation to make it universal for both men and women. But I thought, you know what, women have been behind the eight ball for too long because of their conditioning. So that book is, even though the principles apply across genders and all the spaces in between, it was targeted for women. So I'm in the process of writing the sister book, if you will, the sequel, The Art of Feminine Negotiation for Men, Why Junkyard Dog Tactics No Longer Work. And talking about the conditioning that causes men to believe that they can't lean into their softer skills when it would in fact serve them better. So let's hope there's reception for it out there in the universe.
Oh, absolutely. Sometimes you gotta be a beauty and a beast, inner beauty and the ability to take out the garbage. That's the winning combination, as RuPaul says. Cindy, thank you so much for sharing your insights and great stories and your great book. When is it going to be published?
The second one should be coming out in the fall of this year, if all goes according to plan. So,
well, fingers crossed. We hope to hear from you ahead of the publishing because we would love to feature it, and hopefully you will be our guest in the future because that was just not enough. Less than an hour, and as we are heading towards the end, your work is not only transforming our world but also many generations to come. I'm so grateful for you sharing your stories about your kids, and we're leaving here today feeling inspired and ready to make our negotiation style to be more wholesome. That's it from episode 145 of PhD Livestream. Thanks to our guest Cindy Watson. To stay updated and ensure you never miss a positivity hug delivered, follow Woman on it and turn on notifications to be alerted once a video has been released. Next week, we are going to talk with our guest Debbie Ausburn. Join us at 6 p.m. CET, 12 p.m. EST. Thank you so much to our lovely audience, Olga Vasina, Patrick L. Young, and I, Esmeralda. As always, our positivity quote comes from positive thinking only and goes, look for something positive in each day, even if some days you have to look a little harder. The same applies for negotiation. Negotiate positively, and if you don't like something, change it. If you can't change it, change your attitude. That also applies, and that's another great quotation from Maya Angelou. Today is your day to hack the future, hack the positivity you want, and let's join us next week. Thank you very much, Cindy.
thank you for a great conversation.